18-year-old college student, and I'm experimenting with this, and every night that I do it, the National Park Service rangers and people are reporting UFOs being seen all over the area, and this big wave of UFOs start. And I realized that this really works, that you can go into quiet mind, remote view these civilizations wherever they are, using consciousness to see, set up a vector, like a landing vector if you're flying into LAX, that we do electronically, but you do this with thought, show them where we are, and ask them if they're able to come and interact with us. Now, they're not puppets on a string, but more often than not, something will happen. And so I didn't know what to do with this. I'm 18 years old, and I go, well, this is all very interesting, but kind of strange. And then I go on doing other things. And in 1990, I was basically visited and asked to start this entire effort, the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. And the reason for it was that I later learned that there were a group of world leaders in November of 1989, including Papa Bush and Perez de Cuellar and a whole bunch of people who wanted to end the secrecy on this subject, but not in a way that was very conscious. And as an sort of result of this, and then the aftermath of it, something happened that shut that down. And when I had the meeting some years ago with Prince Hans-Adam von Liechtenstein, who's the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, prior to a meeting with him, he had sent me a letter and said, Dr. Greer, you won't be able to do disclosure or contact, but not for reasons you think. I said, what? But I don't want to talk about it. I talked to him on the phone at his castle. He says, well, I'm going to come to New York, let's meet. So we met. And what I discovered was that he and the other people who had been planning this in 1989, now remember this is over 25 years ago, didn't know that within the unacknowledged special access projects, which are the super secret projects that deal with this subject, not just in the US, but in Great Britain, Australia, all over, there's representation in every country, China, Russia. It's sort of its own transnational entity that kind of runs sub rosa and beneath the radar of normal governments. That there was a compartment at operation that had been practicing and had perfected the stagecraft of hoaxing contact. Now this is the part of the story that people do not like for me to tell, but you need to know it, and it's controversial, but it's essential if you're going to become someone who has clarity on this subject. Beginning in the late 40s and 50s, experiments began with electronic systems that led to the ability to alter awareness, but also to create life forms that look like aliens but are not. These are called program life forms. And by 1954, October, we had perfected electromagnetogravitics. What am I talking about? High voltage systems with certain resonant fields and certain specialized materials that allow for us to have lift. A UFO, man-made. So man-made UFOs, which began to be experimented with Werner von Braun and others for Adolf Hitler in the 40s, the OSS, that became the CIA, through Operation Paperclip, brought those folks into our intelligence community and into our early aerospace program and created a whole parallel secret space program that did not involve rockets. So, I always tell people, if you're a rocket scientist, your knowledge is pretty much locked to 1940s. Everything that has been developed since then has been classified. Now, because of this, maybe we can turn off cell phones, thank you. Because of this, there became, as Eisenhower warned, a vast military-industrial complex that was so classified that eventually he lost control of it. And no president since Eisenhower has had operational control over all of these compartments. Now, by the time 1989 came around, there had been probably 100 generations of exponential development of those technologies. And as Ben Rich said, and as I'm sure you saw in the film, Sirius reported at a meeting that Jan Harzan from IBM was at that meeting, he's now the head of MUFON, that we basically had the technologies to take ET home. And that the way that communication happened is that it's like ESP, and every point in space and time is connected to every other point, which is, of course, what we've been saying for a long time. But the technologies that exist in these classified programs begin to be attached to an agenda to deceive people. Because here's what someone said to me in the early 90s as I was preparing to brief the director of the CIA. You hide it in plain sight. You hide everything in plain sight. It's all there. But you put a spin on it so that people are deceived. So it's either ridiculous or it's made to look kooky to keep it out of the mainstream media or academic circles, or it's something very frightening, so people don't want to approach it, they're terrified. And the added benefit of scaring people is that then you lay the foundation for what Wernher von Braun warned us about on his deathbed, that there was an agenda to stage an alien attack on Earth for the purpose of expanding the control of this military-industrial junta that is the biggest industry on the planet today, and seize more and more control through a false flag type operation like the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam, which, as you know, expanded the Vietnam War exponentially when we sort of hoaxed and staged the attack on our vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin in Vietnam. But this would be on a cosmic level. So beginning in the 50s and 60s, a plan was created to have events happen, controlled events, that would convince people that they were having experiences from ETs that were actually being done through what's called stagecraft from people. Now, Pérez de Cuellar didn't know this, the UN Secretary General, nor at that time did Papa Bush, the elder, not W, who was President of the United States in 1989, or Prince Hans Anna von Liechtenstein. But so what happened, and many of you may have heard of this through some of the work and research Bud Hopkins did, was that Pérez de Cuellar was abducted out of his limousine at 3 in the morning out of Midtown Manhattan. Of course, and he was told by the, quote, aliens to stop the disclosure effort, and that if he didn't, every world leader involved, including the President of the United States, would be abducted. And this blew up, I'm quoting from the Prince, like an atomic bomb in the Bush White House. The whole thing was shut down. Everything was shut down. So Gorbachev was involved, Papa Bush was involved, Pérez de Cuellar was involved, and Prince Hans Anna von Liechtenstein. Now, I asked the Prince how he knew about this event that happened to Pérez de Cuellar. He says, because I'm very good friends with him and I was involved in this operation and knew about it when it happened. So that's the true story. Now, what Prince didn't know is that it was staged. It was what's called stagecraft. And I have a document from the 90s from the SSI, an organization that deals with Strategic Studies Institute is what it's called. And it talks about staging and hoaxing UFO events and abductions, it says the word, and mutilations for the purpose of scaring people so that it would create the psychological foundation for conflict in the future between Earth, humans, and these other civilizations. Now, I know this sounds terribly Machiavellian, and it is, but you have to consider, as a Pentagon person told me once, God help us that peace would break out. Because, well, I mean, you know, we're spending almost $1 trillion a year in the United States on military, homeland security, intelligence, et cetera, and so on. So you've got to keep some fires burning. So the whole global terrorism thing that's been manipulated to allow to get out of control, frankly, is to keep that fire burning until they can hit the button on the false flag interstellar. And it would fool almost everyone on planet Earth unless we wake up. So it's like the song from the 1970s, The Who, we won't be fooled again. Well, I think we were fooled again. 9/11 happened and we invaded Iraq. What a disaster. Now we have ISIS. So it's time for childhood's end here. And I'm going into this stuff not to kind of like scare people or be controversial, but I think that you need to know the truth about these things before we go on to what it means to become an ambassador to these civilizations. Otherwise, you're going to be taking all manner of baggage into your contact effort when you're out under the stars with your friends. So let's jettison the baggage and the disinfo packet, the disinformation packet, so that we get clarity on what this is. I don't speak of these things just to sort of put down any other person's research. I think most people are trying to report out what they're finding, but they don't know what the originating source of the finding is. For example, they don't know that EG&G, and prior to that Siemens, were building the implants that were being put into the people being abducted. They think they're from an interstellar civilization, which they are not. So This information is very explosive. People hate it when I speak about it because people like to have someone to hate. Now let's talk about that. Why is it that humans always want to find someone that they can vent otherness onto? Well, for a long time, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in the South. It was black people. I still remember having black and white water fountains in the late 50s and early 60s in North Carolina, where my father worked at a Sears store. Shocking. Then we had to hate someone else, some other culture, some other religion, gay people, whatever it is. You make up somebody that you can vent all of your hatred on and feel that you're better than they are. And where does this come from? Where does this original sin, if there is one, it's this divisiveness, come from? Well, if you study chimpanzees and other primates, which I have done, what you find is that they do organize into troops and into war. And we are 98.5% identical to chimpanzees. So we have this proclivity that can be exploited by demagogues, whether it be religious demagogues, political demagogues, ufology demagogues, covert, majestic, MJ-12, the group that was originally assembled to run the secret UFO programs, demagogues, to turn one people against another, or, like the movie Independence Day, turn an entire civilization against another civilization. Why? Because in that conflict and fear, they can amass more and more centralized power. It's all about control and power. So how do we, it's like that song from In Vogue, free your mind, you know, it's like, you know, remember that song? You got to free your mind, honey, because here's the problem. If you pull all that into your paradigm, what you're going to do is simply replace one enemy for another. And that's what they have always wanted us to do. They've always had at the ready the next level of conflict, the next level of enemy. And the big one is not in Iraq or Tehran, it's out there that they're wanting to concoct. So I think we have to be very careful that we are not manipulated into this stupidity. Because if we are, we're going to get into the biggest catastrophe in human history, much worse than World War II. And I will remind you that no less a figure than General Douglas MacArthur in the well of the Congress in the 1950s, when he was leaving his post, said World War III will be interplanetary. So this xenophobia and fear-mongering and what have you began to be hatched about the time I was born in the mid-50s, and before many of you were alive. So we have to understand that the ability for a group that has trillions of dollars at their disposal to falsely inform people and to manipulate in a propagandist way, much like Hitler did against Jews and gypsies and gay people and socialists or whoever it was to justify the Holocaust, that psychological warfare propaganda was basically taken from the ashes of World War II and then reapplied to this subject, which pretty much explains most of what is known as retail ufology. And it's for this reason that, of course, I've always been the black sheep in that field. Because people do not, I mean, you know, it's like Gloria Steinem said, the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. So people, you know, always say, we just want to know the truth. And I'm going, well, I'm not so sure you do. But I'm going to share it anyway. Now, this is what I learned in the early 90s. I didn't know this until the early to mid-90s because I didn't have meetings with people who were read into, military speak is read into, or briefed, at that level of compartmented intelligence, top secret SCI, special compartment intelligence. And I began to meet with not one. If I had heard this from one person, I would have dismissed it as crackpot. But I heard it from dozens. And then it began to make sense. But the problem is, there are people who've had contact. They get labeled an abductee, but they've had contact that was actually ET. And then you have people who have been targeted with what are called programmed life forms that are these robotic creatures. Everybody's seen the Stan Romanek tape of Boo, that little ET thing in the window? Well, there's one that Disney Studio bought up the rights for that no one has seen, but a few of us. I saw it in his kitchen, of one of these PLFs breaking into his house through a canister. He passed out, the camera falls over, and it's this gray that looks like a robotic thing. And someone from the intelligence community who apparently knew his father, who was in the Air Force, kept calling him with a sound-modified, voice-modified British-sounding woman's voice saying, "Stan, it's one of the fake ones. It's one of the fake ones. It's one of the fake ones," over and over again. So when I got to Stan Romanek's house in Denver, he said, "What does this mean, a fake one?" I said, and there was a MUFON investigator there who was supposed to be an expert on abductions. And I went, "Well, this is the ones that are being made in the outback of Australia at Pine Gap and at Dulce and at the Dugway Proving Grounds and underground bases, and they're nanobio machines. They're biologicals that are robotic and have integrated circuits in their neural cortex. They're man-made." And people looked at me like, "What?" I said, "You don't know about that?" It began to be written about by Martin Cannon in 1988. So this is old news, but somehow it never breaks its way onto the History Channel. It never seems to find its way onto the Discovery Channel. It's Alien Invasion Week on the History Channel, or in the UFO conferences, or on radio shows, where if you talk about this, you will be blacklisted, which I have been. So this is the deepest, darkest part of the secret of the UFO issue, that they have developed technologies that can masquerade as ET that aren't, that there are technologies, as Ben Rich correctly said, the head of the Lockheed super secret skunk works up here in the high desert of California, where we could take ET home. We've had anti-gravity, so-called electromagnetic anti-gravity, what have been termed ARVs, alien reproduction vehicles, which is a misnomer, because humans started experimenting this before we had Roswell. It got augmented by Roswell. But so we've had that since the 50s, but everyone ignores. Now, I'm a medical doctor, and I have family members who are PhD geneticists from UCSF and other top schools. Everyone's ignored the biological. So people think that, well, UFO people get their minds around the fact that there's been some really top secret stuff that's happened with free energy and anti-gravity, but a concomitant level, and maybe larger level, of top secret research has been done on biologicals. And I began to experiment with it. So here I am, I'm an 18-year-old college student, and I'm experimenting with this, and every night that I do it, the National Park Service rangers and people are reporting UFOs being seen all over the area, and this big wave of UFOs start. And I realized that this really works, that you can go into quiet mind, remote view these civilizations wherever they are, using consciousness to see, set up a vector, like a landing vector if you're flying into LAX, that we do electronically, but you do this with thought, show them where we are, and ask them if they're able to come and interact with us. Now, they're not puppets on a string, but more often than not, something will happen. And so I didn't know what to do with this. I'm 18 years old, and I go, well, this is all very interesting, but kind of strange. And then I go on doing other things. And in 1990, I was basically visited and asked to start this entire effort, the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind initiative. And the reason for it was that I later learned that there were a group of world leaders in November of 1989, including Papa Bush and Perez de Cuellar and a whole bunch of people who wanted to end the secrecy on this subject, but not in a way that was very conscious. And as an sort of result of this, and then the aftermath of it, something happened that shut that down. And when I had the meeting some years ago with Prince Hans-Adam von Liechtenstein, who's the Crown Prince of Liechtenstein, prior to a meeting with him, he had sent me a letter and said, "Dr. Greer, you won't be able to do disclosure or contact, but not for reasons you think." I said, "What?" But I don't want to talk about it. I talked to him on the phone at his castle. But he says, "Well, I'm going to come to New York, let's meet." So we met. And what I discovered was that he and the other people who had been planning this in 1989, now remember this is over 25 years ago, didn't know that within the unacknowledged special access projects, which are the super secret projects that deal with this subject, not just in the US, but in Great Britain, Australia, all over, there's representation in every country, China, Russia. It's sort of its own transnational entity that kind of runs sub rosa and beneath the radar of normal governments. That there was a compartment